Hello everyone from Ukraine, you're watching Channel 24. My name is Andriy Drozda and our guest today is Mr. Andrew Michta, well-known international expert on security issues and the Dean of the College of International and Security Studies at the George Marshall Center. Thank you for joining us today, Mr. Michta.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So we will start from the first question from the news, actually. Well, this week started in Ukraine from another series of Russian missile attacks on Ukrainian energy and civil infrastructure. What are the goals and the intentions of Russians when they massively attack Ukrainian power stations by cruise missiles?
I think what the Russians are trying to do is to break your political will, destroy your infrastructure, make sure Ukraine is dark and cold and unable to make it through the winter. I think he thinks that way he will achieve through terror, in effect, through attacking civilian population, what he has not been able to achieve on the battlefield, that is a defeat of the Ukrainian military. So this is a behavior of a country and of a leader that, in my view, is running out of options, and he is just trying to terrorize the Ukrainian population and destroy your infrastructure to make sure you cannot function as a state.
Got it. And we see now how this Russian missile attacks activated, pushed the Western powers to provide Ukraine with more defense equipment, air defense equipment. How would you generally assess the defense support, estimate the defense support of Ukraine from the West? Actually, wasn't it too slow for all these months from the beginning of this full-scale invasion?
Well, I think you saw that my country stepped up very quickly. The United States has been the leading supplier of weapons, and we increased the range and the types of weapons as the Russians shifted their tactics and their operations. Other countries have also been forthcoming. The Canadians, the Brits, the Poles, in their small capacity, the Balts, much smaller countries. There's been some issues with the key European players, but you have to keep one thing in mind. This is not just a question of political will. This is a question of the extent to which key European allies during the Cold War have reduced their stockpiles of weapons and ammunition, in effect disarmed, because the assumption was initially that the Cold War has ended and that was not needed. So part of it is political and kind of reluctance to escalate the situation. But from my perspective, it is Putin who's escalating the situation. You're defending your home, you're defending your homeland, and that's how I look at it. We just had yet another drawdown of our stocks in the United States to support Ukraine. So I don't see any change in the U.S. position and the key allies in NATO when it comes to supporting your country.
Well, yes, the general position is not changing, but Ukraine was asking for air defense systems from the very beginning, from the late February, from the March, and just in the recent days we're getting what we really need in this case after all this massive attacks week by week. So that's what I'm asking about.
I understand that, and I think that until and unless you have addressed the question of effective air defenses, the Russians will continue to use their terror tactics to hit your infrastructure. I mean, that's pretty clear. I see some movement on this. I believe Germany supplied the Iris-T launcher to Ukraine. The United States is looking at options, and I think that just like you saw with every other weapon systems, it's a gradual. I understand your frustration. I understand that people are dying, and it's very difficult to accept the political argument of it. But in a democracy, it takes a number of decision makers from the parliamentary side to the executive side to reach these conclusions. But I am optimistic in the sense that at every turn, the West has provided the weapons that the Ukraine was asking for. If you look at the case of the HIMARS missile launcher or the 777 howitzers, that was not in the original mix, and now it is firmly in that, and the ammunition is forthcoming for that as well. I think we're moving in the direction where Ukraine will be receiving the systems that it needs. But again, it's a political process that sometimes grinds. I think the most important thing in this discussion is, I think, a clear message from the United States and its allies that we remain committed to a sovereign Ukraine, and a Ukraine that is not dominated by Russian imperialist aggression.
I understand. And you're a co-author of the book, The Future of NATO. Was NATO really ready for the threats coming from Russia? Now, how is NATO's strategy and vision is changing right now after all this became obvious and Russia opened the cards?
NATO transformed itself after the Cold War because of our global war on terror, the attack on 9/11, and then our counterinsurgency operations. A lot of NATO allies changed their forces, reformatted their forces for those counterterrorism out-of-area operations. That has been changing now quite dramatically in the U.S. case. The United States is now implementing an Army 2035 program, which is going to end up recreating, reformatting the kind of state-on-state joint force by 2035, probably earlier than that. And the Europeans, after the Madrid summit, have clearly recognized that collective defense is the principal function of NATO. Now, again, because so much of the defense spending and of readiness was neglected, it will take time for the NATO allies to reformat. Here's the important thing. We have NATO politically unified today, which is extremely important. And we are working very hard to make sure that that unity remains. It's very important at the political level because Putin is trying to break that unity. And I bring this up because some of your frustration as to why you are not receiving from every ally the same level of support at the same speed is because that political process is very laborious and tenuous, and we want to make sure that as we move forward, there's consensus across the alliance. I think it will take several years for NATO to fully refit, but I think the Europeans in particular are fully capable of providing the kind of deterrent force supported by the United States with nuclear umbrella, with high-end enablers to make sure that deterrence holds. And what your country is doing is truly remarkable in the sense that it has stood up to Russian aggression and has, in effect, nullified the kind of two-theater crisis that the Chinese and the Russians were setting up for the West, one in Eastern Europe and the other one in the Indo-Pacific. You are basically stopping Russian expansion into Europe.
And when will Ukraine actually become a NATO member? Is it possible while this conflict with Russia continues?
I personally believe that we cannot address European security without Ukraine being a part of it. Clearly, the alliance is not ready to offer membership to Ukraine yet, but I believe that this will come up more and more in the discussions, whether it's a full Article 5 membership or some form of umbrella security guarantees that the alliance will provide. As you probably know, I've written about that in the past. I believe that EU membership for Ukraine, which is the principal focus of conversation right now, actually hinges on Ukrainian security. If you look at the extent to which your economy has been devastated, I just followed the October 25 donor meeting, the new Marshall Plan for Ukraine that Ms. von der Leyen and Mr. Scholz hosted. It's clear that with every passing day, the price tag on rebuilding Ukraine is going up, number one, because of the devastation that the Russians are bringing to bear. And the second question is this, we need private equity, we need private investment in addition to government and international financial organizations supporting and bringing money to rebuild Ukraine after the war. And for that to happen, there has to be a secure Ukraine. No private business will go into any country that is constantly under existential threat of war. So security for Ukraine, whether in the format of full NATO membership or in some other format that the allies will agree on, I think will come up on the agenda and will need to be addressed.
Got it. You were born in Poland, and now Poland is one of the closest allies of Ukraine and supports us very much. We feel it, we know it, we admit it, and we are very thankful for that. And I would like to ask you how this Russian attack on Ukraine has changed Poland's foreign and defense policy, or did this policy begin to change even earlier with the comprehensions that Russia is a very dangerous neighbor?
I don't think it's just Poland. I think it's the entire flank. It's if you go to the Baltic states, if you go to Poland, if you go to Romania, countries that live next door to Russia have had very comprehensive appreciation of the Russian threat over the last 20 years. Especially since Putin came to power, he basically created the narrative of a Russia that's been mistreated by the West, Russia that needs to return to its rightful place in the sun, the kind of imperial narrative. I don't want to overdo historical analysis here, but similar to what happened in interwar Germany that produced Hitler, that Germany was not really defeated in World War I, but was betrayed. And that's the narrative that Putin has been pushing. So you see the increase in countries along the flank, including Poland, in how they're building their militaries and how they're working with your country to make sure that your country succeeds. But the really transformative part of that is also the fact that the Finns and the Swedes are joining the NATO alliance. I mean, this is truly transformative in terms of both the security of the Baltic states, the kind of geostrategic depth that this will give from the high north through Norway, down Scandinavia, to the Baltic states and into Poland. It's basically given additional 830 miles of border, of NATO border, that Putin has to worry about. And it is also bringing two very capable military forces, small granted, but very capable, into the NATO alliance. So this entire conflict, in my view, is what I call a system transforming war. It's changing European security architecture. Some politicians in Europe recognize this more quickly and act accordingly. Some are a little bit slower to recognize. But again, democracies need time to adjust. And I think the commitment to provide you with the means for your defense and to prevail in this conflict has not wavered.
Well, recently Ukraine attacked Russian ships in the Bay of Sevastopol, and the Black Sea Fleet, Russian fleet, suffered a lot, significant losses since the beginning of this full-scale war, including they had lost their main ship, Moskva. So until now, Russia was dominant country in the Black Sea region. They had a navy. They still have a navy, though they lost a lot of ships. What will be the security strategy in the Black Sea region after Russian defeat in this war?
Well, again, the question is what will be the end result of that conflict, right? I mean, I think the Ukrainian position is very clear. You want to reconquer the territories and you want to reestablish sovereign control over the areas that the Russians invaded. Much will depend on the conditions of the Russian military at the end of this conflict. And I personally believe that if the Russian forces are not defeated in Ukraine, and in a way that the Russian public understands was an unequivocal defeat, then Russia will continue to present a threat to Ukraine and to Europe as a whole. That Putin will rearm, refit, and continue, press on again. And there are differences among analysts how long it would take him to get to that point. Look, Ukraine has to be a Black Sea nation. I mean, if you don't have your window into the Black Sea, you don't have the ability to export and trade and grow and become a prosperous modern republic. Quite frankly, the same goes for the Donetsk region, for your industrial areas that the Russians have devastated. Ukraine cannot emerge, in my view, from this conflict bereft of its industrial base, locked out of the Black Sea area. These are absolutely fundamental questions for national security of Ukraine. I would add another thing. I've been always very impressed, and I've done a lot of work with Ukraine and Ukrainians, both civilian and military parliamentarians. The Marshall Center has been involved in working with your government for several years now. Our former director was a senior advisor to your defense minister on some issues concerning defense planning. And we've had a number of Ukrainian parliamentarians here. So I'm always struck by one aspect that you bring to the table. You bring a very highly educated population, a large population. I understand that the fact that so many refugees have left Ukraine, that's the result of the war, but it's temporary. I also think this war has consolidated Ukrainian national identity to the point that the attempt by the Russians to play the eastern parts against the western parts, as they claimed they could in the past, I don't think that anymore obtains. So I see Ukraine as a country with tremendous potential. Your land, your natural resources, some of the most fertile land in Europe, anywhere, right? Anywhere in Europe. Your population, your industrial culture and tradition that has been decimated, but that will come back. And let me say the following. I think one of the most important aspects of this conversation today should be really reimagining Ukraine as it should come out of that conflict, thinking about what Ukraine should look like as a prosperous democratic state, not a post-Soviet Ukraine. This is not about going back to what it used to be, but how the West can bring its resources to bear to help Ukraine take its place in Europe. And so much is riding on this. I believe that the future of Belarus also depends on what happens in Ukraine. I cannot imagine, and I visited Minsk on several occasions before the war, I cannot imagine that Lukashenko could continue to terrorize his population and serve as a Russian client, having a prosperous, democratic, Ukraine right next door. I think the political impact of that in Belarus itself would be very profound. I think that's why Putin believes that he's fighting over Russia being an empire, Russia coming back into European politics again with military power, issuing threats, Russia blackmailing Europe with energy. You're fighting to stop that, to reverse that, and to reimagine Europe as it should be, free, democratic, and prosperous.
And how big are the chances that after all these losses, all these failures on Ukrainian battlefields, Putin will stay in power for the years to come, will keep its regime preserved, and will freeze conflict on Ukrainian front lines and battlefields?
I think a frozen conflict in Ukraine essentially means that it would be very hard to rebuild Ukraine. Because, as I said, having a situation where Russia constantly presents a threat. You've lived with Russian incursion and occupation of Crimea, the unlawful seizure of Crimea, the seizures of territories in Donetsk and Luhansk for years, and you know what this looks like. I mean, it is very hard to actually reform and transform the country. As for Putin, much will depend on what the end state in Ukraine is. That is, what happens to the Russian army in Ukraine. He's made a series of very serious mistakes. Initially, he didn't really mobilize. He tried to present the kind of narrative of a special military operation. He kept his troops in the field for too long, and he grossly underestimated the Ukrainian military and greatly overestimated the capability of the Russian armed forces. I think in part because he was lied to, and in part because Russian military, in my view, has reformed only in very select aspects. It's still in many ways a post-Soviet military, whereas the Ukrainian armed forces are very much built in the NATO kind of mode and trained as a Western force, very effective. Much will depend on what China does, I think, in terms of Putin's future. Putin has all but ensured, in my view, that Russia is tracking to become a junior partner with China. He's actually vassalizing Russia vis-a-vis the Chinese. The Chinese are scoring now by having access to Russian resources. He's trying to offset some of the sanctions by selling his energy to China in other places. So if the Chinese decide that they want to throw their support in behind Putin, I think his position will be stronger. Judging by the 20th Party Congress in Beijing, I'm not very optimistic that President Xi of China would disavow Putin. I think as long as Putin controls his national security, interior, secret police apparatus, I think Xi will provide him some support. I think the real change would be if Putin's actions begin to impact Chinese interests directly. Remember that the Chinese had great plans on building the Belt and Road Initiative. It was going to cross-cut across Europe and create the kind of supply chain network that would favor Chinese industry and bring in resources from China and money. Putin starting that war has in effect put that on ice. And so there's a number of other issues, and much depends on how high he will go on the ladder of escalation. If he escalates, as you know, he makes threats of using nuclear weapons. He is trying to intimidate the people. Much will depend on that. Can Putin survive if he is truly defeated in Ukraine, if the Russians are defeated in Ukraine? I think the chances are about less than 50-50 in that case, because if you look at Russia historically, every time the Russian military was defeated on a battlefield, you saw domestic fragmentations, you saw internal fissures going up, whether it was the 1905, the Russo-Japanese War, the results of defeat in World War I, and then the kind of fear Stalin was showing in the initial phases when the German Nazi forces were moving into Russia, and he, I think, feared the same thing. So again, what's happening on the battlefields in your country, I think, will write that piece of the history book.
And Russia suspended its involvement in the international deal that allows Ukraine to export our agricultural products and grain from the Black Sea ports. It happened actually after this recent Ukrainian attack in Sevastopol. And what are the real reasons, from your perspective, for a Russian rejection of this grain agreement? And how will it affect on food security in the world?
Well, I mean, that's what Putin is counting on. What they're trying to do is create pressure across the board from governments that are in the West and governments that are not in the West to make sure that maximum pressure is put on the allies to force Ukraine, to push Ukraine towards some sort of a negotiated deal. That agreement that was negotiated that allowed for the export of Ukrainian grain was absolutely instrumental in averting the threat of famine, in Africa. And now he has reversed that. You've seen the same behavior when it comes to energy. What he did with the gas pipelines, claiming that one of the turbines was not properly functioning. The Canadian turbine was not really the right turbine. I mean, these are all games. The net result is putting maximum pressure, probing for areas where the Europeans or the Americans can all of a sudden start looking at some very near-term objectives, start negotiating. Remember, if he gets to a negotiated deal right now, if you were just to freeze this conflict as is, that would still be a victory for Putin, even though your army has scored so many victories by liberating large areas of territory in your current offensive, because he would still end up sitting on a large portion of Ukrainian territory, and he would buy himself time to refit, re-equip, and train his military. So he will continue to do this. I think he will continue to behave without any regard for international legal norms, for the law of war, and how you treat the population. The types of munitions that he's using that are illegal, he nonetheless is using them. It is basically terrorist behavior rather than state-on-state conflict. And he's doing this because his military is finding it very difficult to deliver the kind of successes that he wanted. Initially, they obviously promised him a lightning-fast operation, that they will destroy the Ukrainian government, arrest President Zelensky, or maybe kill him, or whatever their plans were. None of that happened. They probably expected another operation like they did in Crimea, using information operations and basically paralyzing the Ukrainian forces. None of this happened. Then after the Ukrainian victory, when they tried to move on Kiev, they moved to the kind of Soviet-style approach where they started murdering people at long distances, using heavy artillery and rockets. Now, with the provisions of long-range artillery and HIMARS to the Ukrainians, that has now been evened out. And so he's groping. And what worries me is that he will continue to target the civilian population. And as the winter is coming, it's going to be very, very hard on the Ukrainian people. But I see the determination and courage that the Ukrainians have demonstrated. And I have no doubt that Ukraine will prevail in the end.
And probably our final question, how would the economy of Germany, economy of France and other prominent European Union states would be changed after this war as a consequence of this war? What would be the short-term and the long-term consequences of the Russian aggression on the economy of European states?
I think that change is already taking place. I mean, the entire economic model that relied on cheap energy from Russia, China for the market and cheap components, that kind of model has shown itself to be unsustainable. And I think that if you look at the decisions, including the German government, the fact that 2 of the remaining 3 reactors in Germany are kept operational. The Poles are in the process of negotiating for a nuclear reactor with Westinghouse to start that in their country. I believe that this will be a very rough and difficult period for the European economy because the change is so fundamental. The kind of good old times are not coming back. I think for some corporate leaders, this needs to sink in. They're not yet fully appreciative of how profoundly that war is impacting their bottom line and their ability to operate effectively. And also, it will change, I think, the conversation about energy policy across the European Union. Natural gas was considered to be the green fuel, the gateway to renewables, kind of a transition fuel. And the Russians leveraged this, and I think they lobbied for this vehemently across Europe over the last 20, 30 years between Schroeder, Merkel, and up to the present crisis in Germany in particular. This has to be rethought. You cannot have an energy policy that's separated from national security considerations, because I don't have to tell you as a Ukrainian that the national security function of the nation state is the most important, irreducible function any government can perform. Without that, you don't control your political system, you don't control your economic structures, you become unfree and dependent. We are likely going to look at some very difficult times. Remember that the present energy crisis that the Russians are creating, they've created it by invading Ukraine and now by playing with energy supplies. I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't affect a complete cutoff, of energy supplies to force this winter, the pressure on Europe to reach what they would hope would be a breaking point. But I think if I believe Europe will make it through the winter, regardless of these difficulties that we're going to face, I think that lesson will sink in, and you will see a very different energy model and economic model develop. In the United States, we have a conversation about that as well, and this impacts, in our case, we're not in the same energy situation as the Europeans are, but we're looking at our supply chain network connectivity to China. And I think the Europeans will have to revisit that as well. Can you rely on your adversary, on your critical supply networks? And my view is no, you cannot. You add to this the impact of the pandemic, and during that pandemic, governments across the West pumped a lot of empty liquidity into the system. So the inflationary pressures you see today is a combination of both the energy situation that you see and of the kind of lingering impact of the pandemic. If we have another outbreak this winter, this will aggravate the process even further. Let me just conclude on saying this, but what we need to leverage is the political unity that we've been able to achieve, both at the level of NATO and at the bilateral level in government-to-government relations. This is a system-transforming war, what's happening in your country, as I already said, and that it transforms security of Europe as a whole. I mean, a successful Ukraine finally ends the threat from Russia, removes that conversation about the crash zone in Europe and, the area where wars would historically ignite, and gives an opportunity to Ukrainians down the line to the Belarusians to be part of an open, free, and prosperous Europe. And what it means for the Russians, it forecloses the path of empire. Russia that loses in Ukraine will, for the first time since it became the imperial power, and especially since the 17th century and started really expanding into Europe, it will have to come to terms with what it means to be a normal state, pardon me that I'm using that expression. Whether it will be the federation as it remains today or some sort of other configuration, I don't know. That's for the Russians to figure it out.
Got it. So unity is the most important thing right now, and we will keep it to it through this winter. Mr. Michta, thank you so much for this conversation, for your answers. It was extremely interesting dialogue for me. Thank you once more for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you. And we stand with Ukraine. All the best.
And thank you, our dear audience, for watching. Mr. Andrew Michta was our guest today. We hope to see you soon with our new guest.